Okay, today we're going to look at something, an article by Thomas Sowell, and it's trapped between these two stories, one of which is the ending right here that it shows, and that actually has nothing really to do with what's fixing to come up, except for he talks about myths to live by, and then he suddenly goes into this. The real name of this actual piece section is here the Hollywood movie that destroyed black Africans forever. So let's look into this, for this is about roots. I'm not sure if you even watched the movie, but it seemed to be a compulsory thing for everybody had to watch it and all of these things that went on through the 70s and into the 80s and stuff. And of course, there was like Rich Man, Poor Man, and all these other series that were on TV that were real important. You had to watch, and they pushed this one on us too. We'll get into that a little more, but I want you to understand that this man has gone deep down a rabbit hole to give you this information and then put it all together, and perhaps versus what you're told versus the reality of things. And I'll elaborate and come on every once in a while. I hope this doesn't get flagged for using these animations. Let's continue.
Contrary to the myths to live by, created by Alex Haley and others, Africans were by no means the innocents portrayed in Roots, baffled as to why white men were coming in and taking their people away in chains. On the contrary, the region of West Africa from which Kunta Kinte supposedly came was one of the great slave trading regions of the continent, before, during, and after the white man arrived.
So what he's explaining here is that the narrative that we're all given, that like everybody was just fine and black people were just hippies running around in the jungle over here somehow, and Whitey came and ran through the jungle and tried to capture him and everything, had no truth in it whatsoever. In fact, they had been capturing and selling each other off to each other for all of recorded time that we can quite give. I'll also show you something quite revealing here in a minute that's probably something that Thomas Sowell would not show you, for he's just trying to get a certain point across here, and by doing so he elaborates quite a bit. I'm going to elaborate a little bit more, but here's this idea. By the way, the circle over there where Kunta Kinte is supposed to come from, that's not quite accurate either. It's a little bit more south and east from there, and more down in that green area that's supposedly where he came from. But they came from all over the area, and how did that happen? Let's look into that.
It was Africans who enslaved their fellow Africans, selling some of these slaves to Europeans or to Arabs and keeping others for themselves. Even at the peak of the Atlantic slave trade, Africans retained more slaves for themselves than they sent to the Western Hemisphere.
Pause. To elaborate, he just told you that they kept more than they ever gave out to anybody altogether. You don't want to talk about the reality of what the slavers even said was going on with these people and what they would do. I probably can't even speak it on YouTube for some reason when we're talking about the truth and elaborating on it. And somebody would try to say that's a lie, and you can tell that that person was probably steeped in this idea, and so he can't fathom the reality of how different it was. We will again get into that more, but this had been going on for a long time. Wait, hold on. So it's not racist at all or anything? Well, they've tried to make this special word and all this other stuff, but it's all based on this idea that people came out with much later and have twisted around and stuff, and it's not really true. For everywhere else in the world, people have enslaved each other back and forth, and things happened that are recorded that, again, I can't even talk about. The Amerindians themselves, the people of South America, and all their sacrifices and things that went on there. But did things like that go on with Caucasian people or even the Asian Oriental type people? Yeah. There was a difference, though, and we'll get into that in just a moment.
This pattern was not confined to West Africa, from which most slaves were sent to the Western Hemisphere. In East Africa, The Maasai were feared slave raiders, and other African tribes, either alone or in conjunction with Arabs, enslaved their more vulnerable neighbors. As late as 1891, it was reported that Manyuema slavers had demoralized surrounding tribes, destroying crops, and famine reigned everywhere.
It still goes on to this day. Don't even pretend that it went on way after and call it 1891, whenever Caucasians had abolished slavery, and they're not going to have anything to do with it anymore. And the people that were most angered at this point were actually sub-Saharans, who had actually all their life done this thing, and people were trying to get them to change a way of life, which is not what was going on above the Sahara and the way things were, the way slaves were utilized or anything else. It was quite different, but let's not get into that. Let's just make the clear statement that there are more people, and I'll try to show you this again in a minute, and someone else saying it so you can believe in it more than me just trying to pull out something. There are more people enslaved now, still, sub-Saharans, than there ever were in all the slave trade. And people don't seem to care, and they've tried to push this false narrative and all kinds of ideas, and it's really disgusting, especially whenever they rooster around and try to pretend they know what they're talking about and things like that. It's just so far away from reality. And who did this? Well, let's just look here.
Even in the early 20th century, Abyssinians were still raiding other Africans and carrying off slaves. It was 1922 before the British had gained sufficient control in Tanganyika to stamp out slavery there. Arabs were the leading slave raiders in East Africa, ranging over an area larger than all of Europe. The total,
hold on, let's get that.
Number of slaves exported from East Africa during the 19th century has been estimated to be at least 2 million. Despite
what you're told, or led to believe in anyway, the East Africans he's speaking of are not related really to the Nilotics that are there, and the people we call Nubians that are so dark, and also the people down in the Cape over here, known as the Khoisan, that have the click languages and all that stuff, and the gods must be crazy and all that. They aren't related to either of those three. And West Sub-Saharans aren't related to anybody that we talked about too, and they're different and separated, and we'll talk about that shortly, but they're not one conglomerate people. It's an easy thing to say on there, but also we're mentioning here the Islamic slave trade, which went on for over 900 years before the Americas were even found, and Portugal became involved and so on, who, if you look into it, that's quite revealing how that all went out. And I'd like you to mention, try to find Europeans in this mess, and you won't be able to, but you're forced to believe it was you somehow, which is crazy. Let's continue.
Despite the impression created by roots, during the era of the massive slave trade from West Africa, a white man was more likely to catch malaria in Africa than to catch slaves himself. The average life expectancy of a white man in the interior of sub-Saharan Africa at that time was less than 1 year.
So the idea that they were all running down through in the Congo and all that stuff and everything really didn't have much of a effect. It didn't happen much. Very few people tried to do it. A lot of them became lost. There were stories by a few of them going down together and only one making it back, of things that happened that, again, I can't mention here. But we have a trapped people that's over here in an area that really at this point didn't even know the other part of the world existed. And of course, you're taught the narrative that white people went in and tried to wrangle up black people, and it's not the truth thing at all. In fact, quite the opposite. And roots was a thing that showed up whenever I was a kid, and they tried to shove it on everybody. And I remember it got to some sensitive parts, and I looked over at my dad and I said, "Is that the way that it happened?" And he goes, "Not really. Maybe to one person, but no." And there was a couple of times, and it got to the point during this series, because I watched it there in the living room, that I would look over at him and he would just nod his head like, no, 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 and stuff or whatever. Yeah, believe it or not, we recorded it on a VHS. Oh my gosh. And that was kind of real new at the time and expensive. We recorded it on tapes on the VHS, which later got recorded over by a bunch of other stuff. Yeah. And then you found out that he had stolen the story itself from a white guy that had written this thing that was a tragedy that happened one time, and he turned around and tried to make it into a myth. This is what Alex Haley said himself whenever he was caught. He said, I wanted to make a myth that blacks could live by, not the reality of what really had happened. Oh, wow. Yeah, and he had to pay reparations to that guy. Funny we hear that word mentioned associated, but it's kind of the same word used to whenever you plagiarize and steal somebody's stuff that way. Let's continue.
By and large, men from Europe or the Western Hemisphere came to the coasts of Africa, bought their slaves, and left as soon as possible.
They kind of pulled up, and it was kind of like a drive-through slave mart. And they were selling people off for beads and alcohol or less. But over a period of time, they started wanting weapons to take and go out and wrangle up more of them and so on. And it kind of got way out of hand. If you don't think so, look at the world. Or look at this part of the world. Oh, that's right. They don't talk about it because feelings. And in America, you don't get to see anything like you used to see with National Geographic magazine, where once a month they would go into this place and go, have you ever heard of these people from the Pitjantjatjara tribe? They do this, they do that, they eat these grubs, these things happen and everything. Isn't that interesting? No. That ruins the narrative, because there's still pre-Neolithic people running around. Let's continue.
Even so, the death rates among the white crews of the ships carrying slaves to the Western Hemisphere were as high as the death rates among the slaves themselves.
In America, we're taught to cry and weep and do everything about how black people died, or they caught this or they caught that. Well, they ended up catching smallpox because they had never witnessed it before, like the Egyptians and all of North African Caucasians had before. So in that endeavor, it got broke out to them. It became quite a thing, and so there were a lot lost by that. But believe it or not, by looking at it, it's not a number you can dicker back and forth and about even. Enough white people, even though they weren't going in malaria and died in the same endeavor. You can think of that as a great thing if you want to from your point of view or whatever, but it's all a tragedy. Let's continue.
It was only much later, after quinine and other medical measures enabled Europeans to survive where there were tropical diseases, was it possible for them to invade Africa in force and establish empires there. But
people look at this as colonizing or all these things about it, whatever. And of course, that quinine is like a whitey cracker magic, and to this day, it saved millions. There are literally populations and tribes that are in Africa that would not exist if they didn't have the incredible medicines brought to them by Caucasians. They were trying to you look back at it in a retrospect, they were trying to bring them into the 20th century somehow. And there's a far difference from where they were as just being tribal or something like that, or pre-Neolithic. And it was just too far of a gap. And it still is, and it's a burden on the world to try to make this happen. But that's not the narrative at all, is it? Let's just look at this more.
But by then, the Atlantic slave trade had already been ended. During the era of that trade, Africa was largely ruled by Africans, who established the conditions under which slave sales took place.
We was kings are the actual people that sold and captured the other people and sold them off and got rich off of it. So to turn around and try to make that comment that's been made before, and people say, oh, it's a hate speech now, whenever it's something that clearly is being invoked by the other people. and looked at as a joke, and then, oh, you can't joke at them for that. And it's like, no, there can be jokes, so things like that don't happen, because guess what? It's still happening. But no, you were the ones that were slow and unlucky and got caught by your own people. And when you start looking at the way that it really worked out, it's totally different than we're led to believe going through school and to have white guilt or any of these things, isn't it? It's quite incredible. You know, of course, we were the ones that ended slavery, not just for them, but for all people. And just a quick boon in here, the first slaves in all Americas were Irish, and not too many of them made it, and they didn't get traded as well or anything else, but we don't want to look into that. We're looking about how Root said this and that, and how Sowell's telling you the way that it really went down.
The crew of a slave ship was in no position to defy African rulers and their armies by going out across the land and capturing people willy-nilly. The stronger African peoples captured and enslaved the weaker peoples. The same pattern found over the centuries in Europe, Asia, the Western Hemisphere, and Polynesia.
So it's been going on everywhere. The radical difference here is one of them was a primitive and not even used to anything that has to do with this type of life. We'll get into that here after this presentation's over with, and I'll show you somebody else on the Joe Rogan show and how he's talking about that. But what they're kind of indicating here is that whenever they tried to end slavery, the black people didn't want to, and it still goes on to this day, by the way, more than had ever been before, because there's so many more due to all the Caucasian medicines and so on, and food we keep giving them and things like that, and to the tune of billions of dollars. But you weren't able to go against that and everything. And it's funny, that movie came out where it was supposed to be the Black Queen King thing, and it was about the Dahomey tribe, and again, white man bad and everything, and people knew enough about it to where it just exploded right in front of them that they were one of the major people capturing and selling off their own people. It's what they even claimed and everything else, and it just folded. And this narrative, and this sad narrative that keeps getting pushed, and one wonders why. Well, you've got to feel like it this way. If you felt like it that way, then, oh, well, one of them is reality here, people. Let's continue.
In Nyasaland, the Ngoni and Yao swaggered over and terrorized other tribes. In Uganda, the Baganda made life miserable for their neighbors.
Now, he's just going to show a few examples of how this was going on here, this was going on here, this was going on here. If you want to read slaver journals and things like that, you'll get a more in-depth thing, and it's actually worse than you think whenever you're just going, la, 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 these guys were doing that to those guys. It's a rationale.
And the Nyoro and Hima of Anko enslaved Toro women and children. The Tutsi dominated the Hutu in Rwanda. The Maasai lorded it over the Kikuyu and Kamba. And the no means the innocence portrayed.
Sorry, I clicked that real quick because it looked like it said Messiah. Instead of Messiah, it said Messiah there over on the side of it, which would be a mistake. We're somewhere right in here.
The Maasai lorded it over the Kikuyu and Kamba, and the latter in turn.
Yeah, it does say Messiah there on the left. It's supposed to say Maasai, like the Maasai warriors. And we watch videos about them and stuff, and how they fought off lions when they come messing with them sometimes, or jump out at them, things like that. Well, they don't show that channel anymore, because even if they showed something that advanced, they're really still showing you a pre-Neolithic people in a hunter-gatherer situation. And we kumbaya and cannot believe that. And here's Kamba, and whoops, but let's continue.
Turn held the Indorobo in a kind of serfdom. It was precisely the fact that Europeans, except for the Portuguese, seldom participated in the raids that captured and enslaved Africans that enabled most people in Europe and the Americas to remain oblivious to the traumatic experience that this was.
Wow, some of these statements are just incredibly revealing and showing basically what he said here. Correct me if I'm wrong down below. is that the Europeans didn't even really know this was going on because it wasn't even their trade thing or wasn't even their deal going on. Well, Portuguese knew about it and everything, and they had been the overlapper of the Islamic slave trade, by the way, and you can look into that and the idea of what went on there and show its reality too, and the differential of the two, I guess you'd say, but he clearly points it out here, and the other people that now, correct me if I'm wrong, are basically blamed on this having happened somehow are the ones that are, the people that didn't even know it was going on and didn't have anything connected with it. They did have a thing with the Irish slaves, though. We can't all seem innocent about everything too, but no, it didn't go anywhere near the narrative that's currently pushed that I see all the time, don't you? Well, that had to be pushed through the media and things like that. Well, I can't get too deep into that. Let's go.
With some Africans committing suicide to avoid capture, and wives being whipped as they tried to cling to their husbands or children.
He's just mentioning one small moment in a slavery trade thing like I'm talking about with this is what went on. And I don't know, back up and listen to it 3 or 4 times.
Historian David Breon Davis pointed out that Europeans had little contact with the actual process of enslavement, and that...
What? No, see, didn't you run down and no, that didn't happen, did it? Well, who was the people? Oh, no. Okay, hold on. Let's just go.
As late as 1721, the Royal African Company asked its agents to investigate the modes of enslavement in the interior. Europeans typically saw only the end results, enslaved people being offered for sale on the coast. It was...
Imagine that way up into 1721, they were making inquiries as to where are you getting all these people at? What's going on here?
Much the same story in the Ottoman Empire, where those who bought slaves had no idea what these slaves had been through before.
Well, we could talk about the Barbary Coast and the Caucasians of North Africa being enslaved and stuff off of it, and then, of course, who were the Moors and all those things that went on after that, but that would be...
Ready to start?
That would be something a little bit different. Here, let's see if I can show you a quickie off of Joe Rogan's show called Slavery is Still Alive. And then something, and then a narrative, and you can see in the thoughts what might actually be true. See if I can pull this up.
When you consider the fact that there's literally more slaves today in the world than there were before slavery was abolished in the United States.
Is that true?
Yeah.
I didn't realize.
Yeah, he didn't realize it was that many. Indicating that he knows it still goes on, but blacks are supposed to be all okay with it. But how are you all okay with it with this narrative you're trying to push? It's just so flippity-floppy. It's like you definitely want to distance yourself from anything about it, but then you want to live off of it, but then it's confusing, and someone has made it that way for you, and you're just running right into it. Let's see the discussion that goes on here. Well, I can't believe Joe's sitting here saying this to this guy. Now, he's supposed to be some type of Coleman Hughes is the guy's name, Coleman Hughes official. I don't know what that's got to do with it. I think he's a personal trainer, God knows what. Let's go on.
There's that many.
Yeah, let's see if that's true. Let's make sure that's true. I'm sure you saw the open markets for slavery in Libya, which is bananas because you're watching slave markets on YouTube.
Yeah.
And
we talk about slavery like it's in the past tense in our heads. You think slavery in the past tense. We abolished it.
A little bit to unpack there, but he just goes, yeah. Oh, I've seen all these massive slave markets and stuff that still go on to this day. No big deal. I'm not really talking about it. But then he goes, slavery seems like something in the past, which is odd because it's always on the forefront, and it's like an out and a secret word and everything else and stuff like that. It tries to get pushed on you whenever you look at the reality of the way that went down, how it could be or something. But the strange thing in that is that he tells you that we abolished it. Now, I'm not sure if y'all have paid attention at all anyway through it, but it wasn't black people that abolished it, and they were mad whenever it stopped, and it still goes on to this day, but hush, hush. and you can't hear anything about it. And we had nothing to do with black people. He's got a lot of admix to him here, but he's not talking from that point, believe me, at all. And we have another idea here, just to throw in there and toss it in. That idea that there was a Underground Railroad, that was white people, or it would have never happened. He goes on in this a little bit more, but I want to show you one more thing here on the way out the door, just to give some clarity in what we're talking about, who was where when, or anything else, and you can look this up yourself. This is kind of difficult for somebody to stomach. Let me see if I can center that. Aslar Man is a later Stone Age skeleton. He was discovered by these people and stuff in 1927, but Aslar specimen has been dated to 6400 BP. Now, BP is before present, so it's 4400 BC, making it no later than the Holocene. Well, the Holocene is when the end of the last ice age, so of course not. Along with such fossils as Irualiru and Ashango. Now, if you'll look at this is a small-brained hominid Homo erectus species that still lives there, and it was found at 11,000 BP, they say right here, next to my pointer. But they've redated it now, and I don't know why it's not on here, because it's 9100 BC, so they even give it 100 years more now, by the way. And Ashango, which also, by the way, is the same situation, where it's a small-brained hominid, i.e. a still existing Homo erectus. And the point of Aslar Man is to say that Aslar is one of the earliest known, in fact, it's the earliest known anatomically modern human skeleton with Negroid phenotype, living in sub-Saharan Africa, or anywhere. Older fossils with similar morphology have been found near Khartoum, dated to 8,500 or 5,000 BC. But in that truth and reality there, what we have is, so they were Homo erectus right until about this 4400 BC range. And if you got into it deep, you would find out that already modern humans admixed them at this point. And we can see nowadays, there's been a genetic article, but it kind of got hushed over, that says up to 19%. So think of it as 20 or 1/5 of the genetics of black people. No one else on the planet has. And that's kind of like Neanderthal, where they were stated that they didn't have any, but due to admix, where people had this small amount, they have a tiny fraction. But regardless of that, they have up to 19% of an unknown ghost hominid, and they say that it's a ghost hominid because everybody else that's possible in the archaeological record's been covered that's a Homo sapiens, and therefore it's a Homo erectus species. And if you put 2 and 2 together, you'll see that becoming a hybrid at 4400 BC, they still retain a lot of that Homo erectus that's still inside them today. They even try to mention Cheek Anta Diop, which has been totally debunked and everything else, but he puts the remains at 6390 before present, so that'd be 4390, and he wants to take 10 years more off of it and say that that's when it really happened and things like that. So it all becomes an extreme mess. Anyhow, the idea of roots was actually stolen from a Caucasian that had written a book about a tragedy, and he stole it and had to give reparations from it. And blacks still live under the idea to this day that that's somehow the way it went down. And Sowell and things that I've said have shown you the reality of the way things went down, actually. You're welcome. Peace.